were talking beforehand, I am pretty sure this is the first farm bill where we've started out with a forum with food companies, with the food industry. And the title of this panel is What Do Food Companies Want in the Next Farm Bill? And we're going to have a great discussion here on this subject. So I will introduce the members of our panel. Starting directly to my left is Chris Adamo, Vice President of Governmental Affairs, Policy, and Partnerships at Danone North America. Matt Dillon, Chief Sustainability Officer at Farmer Focus, and I will add formerly at Cliff Bar. Aubrey Bettencourt, President and CEO of Almond Alliance of California. And last, Dan Christenson, Senior Director of Government Affairs at PepsiCo. One bit of housekeeping before we get started. Some of you all may have had some trouble with the getting on the Wi-Fi. The password, the Wi-Fi password, is case sensitive. So it's Agri-Pulse 2022. The A and the P are both capitalized. So it's capital A G-R-I hyphen capital P U-L-S-E 2022. Okay, I have asked each one of our panelists, so some of you all may not be familiar with where these companies are. We're going to, in terms of their sustainability programs and their interest in what agriculture and their suppliers are doing. So I've asked each one of them to take a few minutes to introduce where their companies are, where Almond, in Aubrey's case, to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into questions, and you can just start putting your questions into Slido, and we will get to those in our conversation here. Chris, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Phil. Good morning, everybody. Good to be here. So I work for Danone North America, and for those of you who don't know us, I'll just do a quick bit on our brands, because we're a house of brands, especially here in the U.S. You probably know us first and foremost as Danone Yogurt. We have a number of other families of yogurt, such as Too Good in the room next door, Oikos, and we also do fluid milk. Horizon Organic is our fluid milk brand. We also do plant-based, so Silk and So Delicious, and the almonds, the coconuts, the soys, and oats, and baby food. So Happy Family Baby Food is our other big company. So that's just a quick example of who we are. So think of the different commodities, obviously, that go to those different brands. Dairy is by far and away our biggest, most important commodity, but then, of course, all those others that I just mentioned. So when we think of sustainability, we have to think about very specific strategies for each one of those commodities. Agriculture is about 60, or it's almost 2/3 of our greenhouse gas footprint when we think of it like that. Water as well is the most significant piece of our water footprint. And so we have to come up with a specific strategy for each brand, each commodity. And like many companies and many folks here probably sitting with me, we're thinking about a net zero pathway to 2050 from a greenhouse gas standpoint, but even more importantly, a 30% net reduction by 2030. So that's coming up right around the corner. And as a dairy company, we have to think about not just soil, but also things like manure and methane, which is becoming a bigger, more predominant part of our strategy and influence. Hopefully that's just a good quick snapshot.
Okay, we'll just go down the line. Matt?
Thanks, Phil, and really good to be here, folks. So Farmer Focus is a company that was started in 2014 by a sixth-generation family farmer named Corwin Heatwell in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And Corwin had a stubborn vision, and I probably shouldn't call my boss of 2 weeks stubborn, but he is stubborn because his vision was to promote and protect generational family farms by providing independence in their decision-making around raising their own poultry flocks. In a sector that is known for integrator models of contract where farmers don't have quite so much independence. And he created a transparent pricing system and approach to raising birds in a humane and organic manner. And the business has taken off. It is the largest exclusively organic poultry business in the United States, fastest growing poultry business in the United States. And on each pack of Farmer Focus chicken, you can find direct linkage to the families that are growing your food. So that approach to generational agriculture is really pertinent to sustainability. I think we all recognize that as businesses, we think in quarterly returns. As farmers, and I'm an ex-farmer, we think in seasonal yields and returns. But really, when sustainability comes to mind, we have to think intergenerational equity. We have to think, how are we leaving behind the soil, the water, the genetics, the human knowledge that are the resources that we depend on in ag and food? And so the vision of Farmer Focus is to expand that opportunity for farmers to think in these intergenerational ways, to build that equity over time. As far as commitments go, I'm 2 weeks on the job. Part of my job will be helping us come up with science-based targets for our climate initiatives and reducing our carbon footprint. Right now, organic and humane raised are some of the key ways that we address sustainability. And we're starting to look into our feed supply chain and ask questions of how could we apply these values of intergenerational equity to the growers who are growing our grains? How do we really develop conservation crop rotational thinking in our grain supply right now? So, thanks.
Aubrey?
So I'm with the Almond Alliance of California, which is the trade association for the almond industry of the United States. I say United States because 80% of the nation's almonds come out of, 80% of the world's almonds come out of California. 90% of the nation's almonds come out of California. If you're making trail mix in Minnesota, you're mine. That's the way I look at it. We represent 7,600 farms in California, over 100 hullers, shellers, and processors. Just over 60% of our farms are less than 100 acres, and 90% of them are family farms. This is a highly sophisticated entity, highly sophisticated commodity group, the largest specialty crop export of the United States. It has been as a grower of almonds, it's been an absolute privilege to be a part of this incredibly sophisticated entity. And if you look at our sustainability goals, we are actually leaning in hard in this space, partly because we're from California. We are a bit of divas in California. I acknowledge that as a fifth generation Californian. But in that space, we've adopted through the Almond Board, our federal marketing order, we've developed what's called the CASP, the California Almond Sustainability Plan, with the idea of focusing in on water, waste, or what I would call co-products, air, pest management, and the idea of reaching various sustainability goals by 2025 in those spaces. My background is in water management and in the arid and Mediterranean climate of the West, which allows us to be the dominant commodity that we are. Water is supreme in the way that we look at our sustainability goals going forward. We also are looking at how we invest both on farm and beyond, but even looking at the changes of climate change and what's happening in that space as well, and the proliferation of pest management in that space as well. And then, of course, dust reduction. It is a bit dusty in a field. Trying to explain that to people sometimes gets a little bit troublesome. But we are working in various technologies and are leaning in these spaces, and we're going to dive into that, I'm sure, on this panel. But the important thing to realize is CASP is actually a voluntary, self-certifying sustainability program, where we're working with our buyers and our consumers because we know that that is what is driving a lot of the demands on transparency, wanting to understand how our products are getting to you, how we're growing those products, what we're doing to take care of the resources that take care of us. In that space, where I come from, in the way that, acknowledging that I'm representing an entity that looks both on farm all the way up to the final product with members such as Blue Diamond and Wonderful and a number of others, a lot of the product that you all are using is coming from my producers. And through that entire vertically integrated supply chain of our industry, I look at sustainability as the economic viability to achieve an environmental outcome. And so when we're looking at the various practices and the goals that we're trying to achieve, we definitely have to have that balance of keeping our farmers farming because they are the mechanism and means to achieve these sustainability goals as we go forward.
Dan?
Thanks. Dan Christensen, Senior Director of Government Affairs at PepsiCo. First, I just wanted to say thank you to Sarah and to Phil, the whole team here at Agri-Pulse for putting on this event. It feels so good to be back in person. I hope everybody shares that sentiment. We were joking before about how it's hard to speak in public in front of a panel. And I say after 2 years of doing speeches on Zoom, I'm actually welcoming this opportunity. You can at least get a reception and a reaction from an audience, which you don't get on Zoom. You just get a screen staring right back at you. So I appreciate that. Like I said, I work for PepsiCo. We're just a small mom and pop food and beverage company that most of you probably never heard of. I joke, we are the largest food and beverage company in North America. We have over 120,000 employees here in the U.S. And like Chris at Danone, PepsiCo has a portfolio of brands that our consumers enjoy all over the world. In fact, our products are enjoyed more than 1 billion times around the planet. And in the U.S. specifically, 95% of U.S. households have at least one of our products in their kitchen. That's not just blue can Pepsi, that could be Lay's potato chips, that could be Tropicana orange juice, it could be Gatorade, it could be Sabra hummus. I mean, you can go down the list. We have a pretty broad and diverse set of products that we deliver and proudly deliver to consumers. But at our core, we really are an agriculture company, and it's fun to get to talk to people about that. We source a lot of orange juice, a lot of potatoes, a lot of corn, a lot of wheat, a lot of sugar beets. All of that are the ingredients that go into making our finished products. And to do that, we leverage relationships that we have with over 12,000 farmers here in the U.S., which makes up, we spend roughly $2.7 billion on ag inputs here, and source, roughly 6 million metric tons of those inputs that go, again, into producing our finished products. So we have a big stake in agriculture. And, when we think about sustainability at PepsiCo, just last year, we announced new sustainability goals, which we have framed under the term PepsiCo Positive. And PepsiCo Positive has 3 main pillars: positive agriculture, positive value chain, positive nutrition. I'll speak mostly about positive agriculture and some to positive value chain. But when we think about positive agriculture, what we're really talking about there is extending regenerative agriculture practices throughout our supply chain. So by 2030, we have a goal to extend those practices to roughly 7 million acres worldwide. And that represents, our share of, so the farming footprint that makes up our supply chain. So that'll be a big focus for us on value chain as well. We have, net emissions goals, as Danone does. And so we're really looking, to the next Farm Bill as an opportunity for us to help advance those goals, socialize those goals. And I think as, we were talking on this panel, I think we have a lot of work to do just to educate people about how much is at stake for food companies in a Farm Bill. This is the first Farm Bill that I can remember, too, where you have as much excitement and interest, I think, from the food company and private sector that you do. So we're looking forward to the opportunity, and thank you for having me on the panel today.
Okay. Yeah, just on that latter point, I think we were talking beforehand, and I believe, Chris, you said you all were working on prepping for the 2008 Farm Bill. You tried to get the consumer-faced companies to get involved, and you got zero interest. Is that right?
Well, I think it's been an evolution for all of us, right? So, if you think back to 2008 and the 2014, especially Farm Bill, we've made major strides in 18 as well on public-private partnership programs. So we had Rcpp, Regional Conservation Partnership Program, in 14. This last one, we had some great amendments to that. We saw a CREP program now start to look out to the private sector, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, a great SIG, Conservation Innovation Grant on-farm soil program. So right there, you have, since the 18 bill, you have 3 really great public-private partnership programs. It wasn't really until 17, 18 that companies like us, CPG companies, started to weigh in. It certainly wasn't the case in 14. I don't think it was quite a mature set of thinking then. But we, PepsiCo and Danone, for example, did some advocacy back in 18 for a handful of different programs. I think this time around, we're probably going to see a much broader crowd of companies advocate for, especially what people may view as sustainability policy to enhance our actions.
Okay, we're going to get more drilled down into that. But I wanted to catch you and Dan real quick on one. We see in polls the consumer cares. If you ask consumers if they want something on a label, for example, they'll almost invariably say yes. The question is whether they will pay more, is whether their behavior follows what they say they want. You all have made these pledges. What do you know about what your customers want and your investors? What are they telling you? How sure are you that this is lasting?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and Chris, feel free to jump in if I miss anything, because I probably will. You know, when we think, so I'm going to give you a little bit of, PepsiCo lingo. We talk about customers and consumers as two distinct entities, right? So customers, those are our grocery stores, right? They're the ones who buy our products, and then the consumers are all of us, right? The people that, eat and drink the products. And, the consumer is interesting, I guess is probably the diplomatic way to put it, because, to your point, Phil, we do hear that feedback that they want these things. They want positive value chain. They want things to be grown locally. They want things to be sourced sustainably. But their tolerance for paying more for that product, I think, doesn't always bear out. Now, I think that is an emerging and changing landscape. So I think as more people become socialized and aware of everything that goes into producing their food, I think there's somewhat of a greater acceptance to that. But it can be a challenge, right? And so I think that's why you see food companies, they move incrementally, right? And so we try and bring these changes to labels, whatever it may be, whether it's USDA organic label, whether it's bioengineered labeling. We do that very deliberately. There's a lot of research that goes into it to make sure that it's something that, at the end of the day, is going to be accepted and embraced by the consumer in the way that we want it.
I'll jump in. I want to give a sneak preview, but I can only give a slight sneak preview, and that is that the Organic Trade Association hired Edelman to do a consumer research study that's going to be dropped next week at the Organic Trade Association conference. And it doesn't just look at organic, it looks at consumers' attitudes around sustainability in general. And again, without getting in too much trouble, because I see someone from the trade here in the room, one of the things that I was shocked by in my sneak preview is that the range of things that consumers are saying they care about is starting to expand. So certainly regenerative practices are new in many consumers' minds and thinking about climate-smart agriculture, although they wouldn't call it that. But also they're more interested in social issues. How are workers treated on the lines? The pandemic amplified that. How are people in processing or food service or retail being treated by the companies that are hiring them? How are farm workers treated? These are things that are starting to show up on the radar that were not on consumers' radar 10 years ago. So I think we as a sector all have to recognize that consumers are not a monolith and that they might evolve a lot faster than our data, our intelligence, or our thinking. And so we have to keep a feedback loop going with these consumers to really develop our ability to forecast where things should go. I will say one other thing about consumer research from my previous employer, and that's that we know that what consumers say they will do and what they are willing to pay for in a survey is different than what they might decide at the grocery store. So at the grocery store, they're sometimes overwhelmed by what I call the NASCARing of products. Consumers are overwhelmed by all these symbols and signs for what they should be buying to align with their values, to Nick's point, to vote with their wallet. They're oftentimes, at the moment of purchase, very confused by all of that, and so sometimes don't make the decisions that they might say they want to when they're in a survey situation.
Chris, we've addressed consumers. What about investors? To what extent are they driving?
Quite a bit. I mean, just a quick recap, and I think Dan said this very well. It's a whole slew of different motivators, right? It's certainly the investors. We see it time and time again through a number of different places, but also our workforce. I mean, we're all, the talent pool out there is tight, and so it just, I mean, I work at Danone because it's a certified B Corp, because we are working on issues like this. I know a lot of my colleagues feel the same. To go real quick on the consumer side as well, we're trying to figure this out. I mean, we have, luckily, this is an asset for us that we have a lot of brands that can do the speaking and we can experiment, because consumers are going to want to hear about this in a number of different ways. They may not want to hear about climate change per se, but they may want to hear about the values and attributes that come with some of the changes that we make for climate change, whether it's clean water, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's our farmer welfare, whatever it may be. So we have to experiment in different ways to figure this out. Certainly, it's not about mitigating bad anymore. It's about being a force for good, and we truly try and embrace that in our experimentation at the brand level.
I would jump in too that we're and I'm seeing a lot of questions about definitions. So I think we're getting into a space where, at least coming from the on-farm production side, where a lot of times we're dealing with confusion about what are the definitions of things. I think the sooner we can define these, even in coming from a commodity group, coming into what is sustainable for, or what is the definition under our, industry, what applies to us, because then that allows for the better benefits and quantifying those better benefits as it works its way up to brand. But also, I think we're caught in a push me, pull you, where in some cases, I always talk about, I think a lot of times our farmers, we might out-solution our problems in some ways. And we get way out ahead in terms of investment in technology or sustainable practices or plant health or worker health or biodiversity or anything along those lines. And I can give you a lot of examples out of our sector where we're waiting for either industry or companies or brands to acknowledge and provide credit back down to the farmer, or we're waiting for policy to catch up, or to acknowledge that, or to help us invest in those spaces, because we have the technology, we know where we need to go, but the barrier to entry may be affordability. And so we're running into this kind of push me, pull you, where I think Farm Bill this year is going to be very essential for us.
Well, let's go right to the Farm Bill and go right to the question that this panel was invited to address. And that is, what do you need from your companies, from your sector perspective in the Farm Bill? What needs to be there that's not there now in terms of spending, in terms of policy? Aubrey, I'll let you take the first
Well,
stab
we're always
at
going to
this, too.
push. Yeah, we're always going to push for market access for, especially as a major export crop. Market access and the MAP funding is a huge component for us. But coming as a water and resource geek, I am hardcore looking at CRP. And looking at modifications and modernization under CRP. I think that's crucial, especially for us in the West. And I know that my Midwestern brethren get a little inky when I say I'm looking at this. I don't want your money, I want new money. But we are looking at, what can we do with the contracts, how we can use that for allowing us for some practices, especially as we look at water challenges facing the West. And this isn't just unique to California. I'd be looking at the rest of the Colorado Basin as well, looking for land practice flexibility and mitigation. As a permanent crop, we're looking for any way we can look into offsets in some of the spaces. I'm glad you mentioned Rcpp. That's a great example. CREP is another one. These provide offsets and flexibility in land management, because we are reimagining the way we use our land going forward, especially looking at water instability, whether that's from a regulatory standpoint or from a natural standpoint, throughout water supply sustainability. I'm also looking at water supply investment in NRCS and some of those practices there. That 508 program could be really essential for developing critical infrastructure from a water supply standpoint and transitioning for our rural communities. I think rural development is an untapped resource, even on farm, but also for our communities as they transition through this. As agriculture is going to change its practices to become a more sustainable, depending on how that is quantified or functioning in its region, these communities need the infrastructure and a transition pathway as they become more sustainable with us, as our processors are investing in their own sustainability and what that changes for our workforce and our rural communities as well. So those are certain examples that we're looking at specifically. I think we're going to see a lot of play at the NRCS side of things. And then also we saw specialty crops, really take a new role, especially coming out of the trade mitigation plans of the last administration. So looking at what that means going forward for the specialty crop world. We got our nose under the tent, and we want to carve out a little more space for us in this space too. And I think a lot of these traditional farm programs have an opportunity to acknowledge some of our. Is that better? All right. I think a lot of our traditional programs have an opportunity to modernize with our specialty crops as well.
Okay, a lot there. I want to touch each one of you. Chris, I'll go to you next. What is the Farm Bill? What needs to be changed, augmented?
1 minute, that's impossible, but long list. But let me just carry on about RCPP just for a second. So we have over 600 farms in the US that we work directly with. We're not compelling a single one of them to do any particular practice. It's just like, it's voluntary conservation at its best. We're giving the menu of options. We're doing the technical assistance. We're providing the planning for those farms. A dairy in Idaho is going to be very different than a dairy in New York, obviously, in many different respects, let alone almonds. So we need to think about that list. We're doing the work. Last year, we spent a record budget for ourselves, over $12 million, just for the financial incentives to do new practices. So we have to look at financing creatively, and NRCS and USDA can certainly be a big help. We worked with NIFWIF in this room. I know Dave Gagne is here, talking about $3 million from a SIG to amplify and accelerate our work. Those partnership programs are going to be absolutely key to continue that evolution, whether it's RCPP, SIG, CREP, whatever it may be. You can't take 600 farms and push them through EQIP. It's just not going to work for a supply chain strategy.
Matt?
Yeah, so Farm Bill in a minute. I might go a minute and a half here, Phil. So
We'll go to that.
we're an organic food company, and organic, like the rest of the world, is experiencing supply chain crises. In organic, sometimes it's felt even deeper because our supply chains are a little narrower. There aren't as many aggregators or processors of ingredients or other value actors in the chains. So I know Secretary Vilsack has already announced some new funding that will be coming out later this year to help support organic transition throughout the value chain. Certainly there's money in the meat processing announcement that was made recently for companies like us, but we really do need more investment in agricultural supply chain aggregation and kind of rotational offtakes. Now, this actually ties back to conventional ag. I recognize organic is a small percentage of ag, and I think we have to be looking at programs that can benefit all producers. There are 300 million acres in this country that have the potential to practice conservation crop rotations, diversified rotations beyond soy and corn. I'm a Nebraska kid, grew up in a Nebraska ag family, never thought I'd work for a chicken company. We had a bumper sticker that said, "Promote pork, run over a chicken." But 300 million acres in conservation crop rotation potential, that has the potential to reduce carbon up to 75 million metric tons a year by improving our conservation crop rotation practices, including bringing grasses back into our lands and integrated animal agriculture back into our lands. So if we're going to do that, we also have to invest in the offtakes. We have to help, in some ways, decentralize the consolidation at aggregator levels as well, in pulses, oil seeds, et cetera. How many farmers right now are getting approached to grow sunflower seeds in the Midwest? A lot. Do we actually have the right aggregation potential for those kinds of rotations? What about, again, if we're going to incorporate animal agriculture back into these crop rotational approaches, where are the offtakes for smaller scale who don't want to sell into a larger buyer, potentially? So that's a key. I'll say one other thing, risk management agency. At the very least, RMA programs have to get out of the way of climate smart agriculture. They have to not inhibit our ability to have our farmers practicing good crop rotations, good cover cropping. We saw some changes in organic specifically last time around. Those need to continue. But secondly, RMA should also be used to promote. I know we don't want any sticks, we all want carrots. But the reality is taxpayer-subsidized premiums should be linked to climate risk or climate mitigation practices. And if you have risk-enhancing practices from an actuarial standards standpoint, those premiums should be more expensive, and taxpayers shouldn't be footing the bill. And if a farmer is doing good conservation practices and mitigating climate change, they should be rewarded.
Yeah, not a ton more to add. I would echo what my fellow panelists here have said. You know, I think we hear this a lot about how no one sector can do it alone, right? The public sector. It is really true, right? It really takes a partnership between the public and private sector to make these practices come to life. Like at Danone, you know, we don't push things on our farmers. We work with them, right? These are voluntary practices. We get much better results when we're educating, when we're working collaboratively with them. So, you know, I think as we look to the next Farm Bill, it's really about how do we advance the work of climate smart agriculture, and how can we de-risk that, right, as much as possible? Because in the private sector, when we see the public sector coming in with a ton of resources, with technical assistance, what have you, I think it makes companies much more comfortable putting forward sizable investments of their own to help advance that work, because they know somebody else is going to be sharing the load with us. Besides that, I would also say for you know, for PepsiCo, and this is more parochial to us, but you know, I did want to echo what Randy Russell had said on the last panel about research. I mean, because we grow so many oranges for our Tropicana brands and others, you know, citrus greening disease is one that really, really impacts us. And that's an area, you know, research has just been woefully underfunded. I have to agree with Randy there. And so the more we can do to advance work, to develop techniques to combat, you know, diseases like that, I think the better off we're going to be in the long term. And you know, I think that's another area where really the public sector has to play the lead.
One comment on research. ARS's budget is a $1.1 billion, I think, was in 2020. About 20% of that went to specifically environmental research, climate being a subset of that. Most USDA ARS research is about adaptation. But there's something that the agency can do right away without a farm bill, and that is really give ARS the direction to start focusing research on climate change mitigation, because that is completely underfunded right now.
In past farm bills, we've had basically a coalition made up of farm groups advocating for the commodity programs, crop insurance, conservation, and nutrition. Advocates for nutrition spending. That was the coalition. We heard a suggestion here that we might have a climate coalition this time. We have the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance. That's primarily farm groups and some environmental groups. Food companies have not in the past played a role there, really, in terms of advocacy around the Farm Bill. You all have each talked about conservation programs in particular. Some of those are way oversubscribed already, including EQIP and especially EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Are you all going to be involved in a climate coalition or a sustainability coalition or regenerative ag coalition, whatever you want to call it? Let's call it a climate coalition.
The simple answer is yes. I think I'm personally already, not personally, Danone is already a part of at least 3. I think they're all represented in this room. I see Agree, I see our Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, and I think Ceres might be in here as well. So for us, it's already started, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's already started. So, I would say sign us up, but we're already signed up, right?
Yeah, I think we all recognize there's a time for competition in business. It's often about competition, and there's a time for collaboration when it comes to the urgency of how we're going to care for these resources into the next generation. It's a time for collaboration, and these guys have mentioned some of the strong collaborations already in play.
I think, coming from a trade position, we're already involved in a lot of these entities and a lot of these collaborative efforts, but even our individual brands. I think the important part is making sure we're talking between each other, right? So that we're aligning and driving as opposed to reacting.
I would just add to that too. I mean, to Chris's point, he ticked off 3 different organizations that are already leading things that you could call a climate coalition for food companies. I think one thing that you will see certainly from food companies, right, is we don't tend to act alone or just as a food industry. We definitely look to partner with folks in the environmental community and others who have that type of credibility, because we recognize to be able to speak with one voice and to be able to speak with a more powerful voice, we need to be able to partner with folks that can do that.
I want to start to getting some of our questions, and this is just off the Farm Bill for a second, but the Security and Exchange Commission this afternoon is expected to announce disclosure requirements, new disclosure requirements for publicly traded companies around their greenhouse gas emissions. For most of the folks in this room, the emissions that count are Scope 3 emissions. Those are your supply chain emissions. It's not clear whether that's going to be initially included in what the SEC proposes, but how could SEC disclosure requirements on Scope 3 emissions, what impact does that have on the farmers that supply you? And Aubrey, and you can address that from more the producer's perspective too.
I just want to say, I mean, obviously we have to see what this rule says. We have not seen any detail yet, but from a Danone perspective, we're effectively already doing some degree of this. We put out Scope 3 numbers at a macro level. We're not giving any farm-specific data. It's all very macro-level data to the Climate Disclosure Project, CDP. We support the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure, which is a global effort. This is happening on a number of different fronts, so this is not a new thing. Obviously very new for SEC to be picking up, but the general topic, and my understanding is most of this data is going to be at a very high, even qualitative level in many respects, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I'd agree there too. I mean, Chris mentioned CDP and TCFD. PepsiCo aligns to that as well. I think we are looking to the extent that the rulemaking aligns to that, and we're already doing it. I mean, I think that's, like you said, this is work that we're already advancing. But I think the key question is going to be in the details and how do we have to quantify that? How do we have to measure and report it? So we're just waiting and see.
Aubrey, are almond producers seeing an impact? When do you expect to see an impact on the pledges that companies are making. In your case, it'll also be affected by their pledges around water usage, I would believe.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, we're already there. And in others, we as an industry have set the pledges for ourselves in a lot of ways. And then as we work through different brands, et cetera, we're starting to develop more in that space. I'm thinking of some of the initiatives of Blue Diamond that's doing investment, especially on pollinators and things in that space. From the water perspective, because we do get, lovingly charged as the devil nut when it comes to water usage in California, but we actually have reduced our water usage by 30% in the last 30 years, and 82% of our farmers plus are using highly efficient water irrigation systems, and we have a pledge to reduce by another 25% over the course of the next 20 years. So we're leaning in and trying to define these standards for ourselves. I think the reporting and the data side of this is what's going to be key. Again, I go back to, and I've seen this from in past lives and other experiences, talking about nutrient management and things like that, how we quantify this, who's granting the credibility for it, the credits for it, how, is it being acknowledged across, and having that alignment between policy and private sector. The data side then, of course, is very important for us. We understand that as a farmer, I know that the data that can set me free is also the data that can chop my head off. So making sure that we're working in alignment through our side of the supply chain, again, it sounds so simple, but protects and provides for our ability to continue to farm and into making these investments. And that involves an economic and a legal structure for us. As a Californian, we're under more stringent requirements than most, and I wouldn't be surprised if our California standards on a number of things are actually exceeding, in fact, I know actually exceed some of the national and global standards. So we're ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, just by legal requirement.
So on what the SEC is up to, I think, first of all, we don't want a cynical public. Right? A cynical public is not sustainable for a healthy democracy. It's certainly not, cynical consumers aren't good for a food system. We all want consumers to trust us. And the trends of companies making commitments and reporting and having ESG ratings that help potentially boost their stock price, that can either be a very good thing or it can be a very damaging thing if there's not credibility, if there's not veracity to the reporting and to the process. So I think, again, as Chris said, we don't know what's going to come out today, but that general direction of creating some veracity to the process is absolutely needed.
That brings up the subject of standards, the credibility brings up the subjects of standards and labeling. And I want to dig into that just a little bit because I know there's a lot of interest in that. Does there need to be a label, a green label, a climate smart label? How does your companies react to that? Does there need to be?
Don't all jump in at once, guys.
Yeah. Does that?
I'll try and speak maybe on behalf of some of the marketers that I talk to, and I'm not sure the marketers are looking for more labels in most cases. At some point, that may become a priority. It's not right now. I think first and foremost, it's actually the step before that, which is how are we measuring? Whether it's disclosure numbers like SEC, as Matt just rightfully pointed out, or if it's how we're quantifying our impact at the farm level. We need to be talking apples to apples on all these cases, so we need the uniform, which methodology should we be using, which tool should we be using? Is it Comet versus another modeling tool? How are we putting quality of data going into those models is important. So we all need to be doing this relatively the same. Otherwise, again, consumers, investors are all confused, and we probably all don't benefit. So getting that, and that's what potentially could lead to a label. If we're measuring the same, then maybe we can speak about it in the same way.
Yeah,
No label until you've got a standard. You got agreement.
Let's figure out how to measure first. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the marketers controlled the dialogue when it first came to a lot of things like regenerative agriculture, and that's a mistake. Nothing against people in marketing and sales, but it's simply a mistake. To Chris's point, processes, data, science have to be leading in this avenue. I do think that the green guide of the FTC is likely going to, they say that they're working on revising it. We've seen trends both in Europe and in the US of companies being sued for climate claims. We've heard signals from US groups like Earth Justice that they're looking at at increasing lawsuits around climate claims that they feel are not backed. So eventually maybe something will come. I will say one thing, again, having worked in organic for most of the last 20 years, we think organic is a climate smart claim. However, we also think that the USDA approach to rules and regulations with organic have to keep evolving so we can really be able to prove that organic is climate smart, because without proof, we're then also no better than anyone who's just popping regenerative on a product. So it's a tension though, right? Because farmers and food companies and aggregators, they want pull through. Hey, we're doing these new practices that have additional costs. We need that cost to be recaptured in the marketplace, and the label is the way to do it. So there's this really challenging tension that I don't know that there's a perfect balance for.
I appreciate you making that comment. I think the other part to it, and kind of tying both of these together, is I'm always hypersensitive to what is working for one type of crop or in one region may be different, may be sustainable than it is compared to another. And I have that variation literally within 50 miles, depending on soil type and water supply among my own commodity. So, it's how you capture that, how you quantify it, how we allow for credit in that is going to be, it's allowing for the uniqueness, but also creating a standard. And it's a balance, and we're going to have to figure that out.
Dan, I want to pivot to the standards issue. You all have been out in the field paying farmers actually in partnership to plant cover crops, so you do have some experience out there in the field with trying to increase soil carbon. Does USDA have to set these standards in the specifically in the area of climate, soil carbon, so forth? Will USDA have to set the standards for what is climate friendly, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say whether USDA has to do it. I mean, there needs to be some sort of standardized metric that people agree to if this is going to be a market that flourishes, right? And so companies are certainly looking to that. I think there's a lot of others that are looking to it as well. Because we need to have some standard base of knowledge to work off of. Otherwise, you're using 1,000 different definitions and nobody really knows what it means. So that's what I would say, yeah.
Chris, standard? Does USDA need to do this?
I think USDA has a role, certainly. I mean, look at the Growing Climate Solutions Act. That was at least not a perfect bill, but a good effort to catalyze a conversation that we need, which is what should USDA be doing to help the private sector along? There are standard bodies out there. Now, whether they're good enough or not remains to be seen, but we have, ESMC, who I know is in the room, has been working on this with standard. You have Climate Action Reserve. You have, Vera. I won't even go down the full list here, but there are bodies that do this. USDA can recognize those bodies. USDA could set we'll call it guidelines that could push those bodies a little farther so that they're more harmonized. I think there's a number of ways that USDA could tackle the problem. They may not have to set the standard, but I think they can certainly influence it.
Aubrey, what I've, not necessarily from almond producers, what I have heard from some producer groups is some nervousness about this idea of climate-friendly commodity. Of commodities being able to be labeled or certified because they meet these standards that we're talking about. Should that be a concern that commodities that don't meet these standards then are something less, worth less?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of are coming back. Well, you're messing with the marketplace, right? I mean, I always get this argument too. Well, almonds they're such a waste of water. Well, if you quit eating them, we'll stop growing them. That's how the marketplace works. I mean, this is kind of basic. And so when you start doing what could be argued as an artificial, putting a thumb on marketplace that in the free market in that space, that could be really a concern. I think in the other part of this comes back to what my comment was earlier. What is sustainable for corn may not be sustainable for soybeans. What is sustainable for almonds may not be sustainable for oranges. But what is sustainable for oranges is sustainable for oranges, and it should be acknowledged, and it should be credited, and it should be quantified, and it should be allowed for us to that. So if there's anything I can encourage my fellow commodity groups, and it's something that I push for within the almond sector, is wherever we can drive forward and make these definitions for ourselves, allow the regulatory space, the policy space, and the marketplace to react to us. I think we have a better chance in that making sure that we have a system that's fair and that works for all of us. Because, we are the experts in our field, and we should act like it in every realm that we're advocating for ourselves. Being this idea that we need to be reacting constantly, and this is where my Californianess is coming out, where we're constantly reacting to this barrage of regulatory standards that are placed on us by people that have no experience in the field with us. Any chance we get where we can lean forward, and I think this is actually why I want to see us as agriculture, as a community, lean in on climate and lean in on sustainability, is because it's a really great opportunity for us to be defining these terms as opposed to be accepting these terms.
Matt, what about those producers who may be worried about segmenting basically commodities into good and bad, climate friendly, climate unfriendly?
I mean, I first think, again, and Chris has touched on this, we really have to understand and define what that is. And Aubrey's also touched on it. Like, what the answer in agriculture is always, is that sustainable? It depends. That practice might be sustainable on that farm, but not on the other one. I think this is one of the challenges that the USDA faces, in that, we hear a list of what we call climate smart practices, these singular actions of cover cropping, for example, or no-till. But the reality is, what's really climate smart is a holistic approach to managing your farm's soil health, water usage, et cetera. And that kind of system approach is not easy to define. I mean, the organic approach is a system approach. It's process-based. Those laws came out in 1990, took 14 years or something to actually get rules, and those rules are far from perfect, as we all know. So if the USDA is going to do this with climate smart, again, how much time is it going to take us? And do we have that amount of time? Some climate scientists would tell us, no, we don't. So I think we have to be doing everything we can to be getting best practices into the hands of farmers now through technical assistance and extension, and practices that are going to pay a dividend for the farmer, not just in terms of long-term historical reduction of climate, of GHG, but will improve their soil and therefore lower their fertilizer bill. So we know, for example, in Iowa, that if you grow a small grain before corn, not only do you put down weed pressure on your corn, but you don't need to use as much fertilizer in the following year, and your yields go up. Matt Liebman, Iowa State University, look it up. It's very solid research that shows that small grains pay an economic dividend as well as have an environmental benefit for farmers. So it's those kinds of actions that need to be moving more than this obsession with a standard and a label.
Dan, I want, any of us have watched farm bills, watched a few farm bills, and you have as well. The biggest fights often are regional. They're not partisan, they're regional. How do you, and there's concern out there in the country, some parts of the country, farmers in some parts of the country feel like they may be worried that they're going to be left behind, they're not going to be able to qualify for as many of those payments that are potentially out there for cover crops or whatever it happens to be. How do you address, from the food industry's perspective, how do you address those concerns that are out in the country and that could potentially complicate the Farm Bill considerations and getting some of the things that you say you need? How do you address those regional concerns? How do you convince farmers across the country in every region that they would benefit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll go back. I really loved something that Randy said on the last panel where he talked about a new line that needs to be inserted in the preamble is food security is national security, right? I mean, I think talking to, and our growers are very good people, right? Very reasonable people that, salt of the earth, obviously, all that sort of thing that you can talk to and have a conversation with. And I think everybody realizes that there is a stake in having Farm Bill, having that policy set, right? It's not always a landslide change. It's not always a sea change. The policy moves incrementally, but at least from a perspective of having stability, being able to plan, having that continuity. I mean, certainly from a business perspective, that's something that speaks to the core of what we do. And I think we find that when we talk to our farmers and our supply chain, they recognize that, right? And so that's a large part of the message that we try to send, is that, you know, this is an important thing that needs to move, you know, for stability and continuity and business planning purposes above anything else. Yeah.
Chris, you all are heavy in dairy, obviously, but you've experienced at these farm bills. How do you address those or avoid those regional?
I'm going to answer this because this could go down a rabbit hole none of us probably need to be a part of, or at least certainly I don't. But from a sustainability conservation standpoint, we need the ability to have companies like us, and there could be others. It doesn't have to be a CPG company. It could be, you know, one of these climate developers. It could be a supplier. It can be certified ag retailers. You know, anybody. We all need the ability to implement on behalf of USDA and the farms. We're not asking any farm to go do this out on their own. We're asking them to partner with us. So the burden is actually on us to work with the farm, to sell the practices, to finance the practices. We need policies that can supplement, complement that sort of strategy. If we just, again, sorry not to pick on EQIP, it's a great program for a lot of reasons, but if we just ask the producer to go to the EQIP line or go to the CRP line, that's not going to work. So we need the type of policies that somebody out there, anybody in the private sector, can go work with government, go work with the farm, rather than just say, hey, go figure it out.
We have not touched at all on the biggest part of the Farm Bill, nutrition, and I can't let this panel go without addressing that issue, and I want to start with you, Dan. A SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is projected to cost $140 billion during this fiscal year, which is over double what it was expected to cost before the pandemic. Does that put a target on that program, especially if Republicans take control of the House? You concerned about that?
Yeah, well, I won't speak to the motivations of any lawmakers, Phil. But you know, I will say, obviously, the larger the slice of the pie that you are, I think in general, I mean, the more that people look to that area of the program. I mean, I think, you know, as food companies, and we participate in this through our participation in groups like SNAP Choice Alliance and others. I think we have an obligation to really educate people about, you know, what those nutrition programs do, the importance that they play in helping low-income families put food on the table. And really, you know, there was a reason why the budget numbers spiked, and that's because we were in the middle of a global pandemic that we'd never seen before, and need had just gone through the roof. I mean, everybody remembers vividly, you know, the footage of this mile of cars waiting in line to get boxes of food during the pandemic. I mean, that's how dramatic it was. And so I think one of the things that the pandemic really reinforced for us was just the importance of having a very stable, well-functioning nutrition safety net in this country, because it really helped people survive.
Chris, have the politics of SNAPs changed at all since the last two goes we had at this, 2014, 2018? Has the experience of COVID and the pictures of the lines, has that changed at all, do you think?
I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, obviously, as if things pick up over the next year. I think, as Dan said, we've all had a very monumental set of experiences over the last couple of years. As a food company, honestly, we're not thinking about the politics in DC on this. I mean, you know, what do our customers want? What do our consumers want? What do our partners want? That we work with different communities, and you know, frankly, for us, it's a broad set. It's SNAP, it's WIC. WIC is one of an incredibly important program for us. We think about a yogurt brand, for example, being eligible for WIC and things of that nature. School meals program. So it's the whole suite, and these are all, you know, this is about healthy foods. It's about access. We all know what it's about. But my point is, as a company, we're not even diving in. We're not doing political surveys to see how people think about it. We're asking, what do our consumers want?
All right. Well, we are out of time. Join me in thanking this great panel for the discussion that we had. At this time, we will hear a message from our next gold sponsor, International Dairy Foods Association, and then Spencer Chase will introduce our next speaker.
Every day, the power goes on. It fuels the people of this great nation and the world. Provides good-paying jobs to millions. Puts healthy food on our tables. Gives our children a better start in life. Knits together our communities and keeps our air, soil, and water healthy for the next generation. That's the power of dairy. For more than 3 decades, one organization has turned on the power, kept the engine humming, united our farmers, processors, retailers, and suppliers in a common goal: to make a difference for dairy. From the halls of Capitol Hill to the White House, from California to upstate New York, from Mexico to China, the International Dairy Foods Association has harnessed the power of dairy to drive economic growth, to open new markets and grow existing ones, to unleash innovation, and to nourish people everywhere with goodness. Spanning more than 450 members, representing all segments of dairy, IDFA empowers our industry today and cultivates the leaders of tomorrow, playing equal parts offense and defense, and fully committed to a healthy, vibrant future for dairy. A future where U.S. dairy leads in diversity, equity, and inclusion, where American dairy is synonymous with sustainable nutrition. That's IDFA. That's the power of advocacy. Join us today.